Can I just say well done to those of you who survived yesterday, who've managed to come back for today. You're particularly brave people for having managed this. And I intentionally wanted to reflect on a psalm this morning as a sort of continuation of what we were talking about yesterday. And so I'd like to begin by reading to you from Psalm 15. If you have your Bible, you might find it helpful to have it open. This is actually my own translation, but I don't think it's too heretical, but it just gives you a sense of something of my own reading of this psalm. So Psalm 15. The heading tells us that it's a melody. It's Davidic. O Lord, who may dwell in your tent? Who may reside on your holy mountain? Those conducting themselves blamelessly, practicing what is right, and speaking the truth within. There is no slander on their tongue. They do not harm their neighbour, nor take up a taunt against their associates. Despised in their eyes are the reprobate, but they honour those who fear the Lord. They swear an oath to their disadvantage and do not change. They do not lend their money with interest, nor take a bribe against the innocent. Those doing these things will never be shaken. Well, as some of you know, Lynn and I have flown over here from Great Britain. We're not originally from there, we're Australian, so if you thought I had a strange British accent, it's because I don't. We speak English in the way that it's meant to be spoken, which is with an Australian intonation. But one of the things that happens when you've grown up in Australia and a really old building comes from the early 1800s, right? Because the British only began formal settlement there in 1788, and all the things that go with colonialisation happened. We won't go into that just at the moment. But there was nothing much there that's old. And when you move to Britain and to Europe, you suddenly discover that things that in Australia we thought were really old, St Matthew's Church in the Rocks from 1810, that is old, right? Turns out, as far as the British are concerned, 3/4 of the churches in the country were built before then. What's your problem? And you see these cathedrals there, these extraordinary buildings. One of my favourites is probably Durham Cathedral in the city of Durham, because the city of Durham is a kind of almost an island in the River Wear. The River Wear does a kind of horseshoe where it almost comes back together on the other side around this island. And then there's this steep hill which rises in the midst of it. And there, on the very top, is Durham Cathedral. It's an extraordinary sight as a reminder to the people around that you are there to come and worship God. Or down in Salisbury, where the land is so flat that when they're looking to find a hill to practice doing a hill start to get your driver's license, because most people are driving stick, so you have to know how to do a hill start. They struggle to find a hill to do it. And so they have the tallest steeple in the country. This extraordinary building that went up in the 1000s, the early 1100s, where people put these things there. But something strange happens now in Britain, and that is that these buildings are more often tourist attractions than places of worship. And so people are often walking in, not so much because they are here to worship God, but because here is an extraordinary building, and they are extraordinary buildings. Every now and then, at least, there's a sign that goes up, no admission unless you're coming in for the worship service. Because otherwise, people come in, there's no sense of grandeur or awe, or I'm here to encounter God. You just wander in. But as soon as they put the sign up to say, worship service only, changes the whole perspective. Because you are there to encounter the living God in a place where people have been worshipping God for 1,000 years. That's quite something when you've grown up in Australia. I know Canadians can push back further than us, right? You know, the Portuguese could too. But, you know, I think once you get into Europe, they've got a longer run on these things than we do. But imagine what it's like, though, for a worshipper in ancient Israel who is turning up at the temple. 3 times a year, the males at least were meant to appear. Women didn't generally, because it was just impractical for women to move children and various other such things. But the men would be expected to turn up. But imagine a pilgrim coming through the road to go up to Jerusalem. It's a long and dusty road. We were shown some pictures of Newmarket in 1910, and the road there looked like a sort of muddy track. And I suspect the road up to Jerusalem would have been a bit like that as well. So here's a pilgrim turning up for one of those 3 times in the year that you are meant to come to Jerusalem. You've come through the hills. You've survived all the terrors of the mountains, whether that's bandits, whether that's mountain lions, whether that's bears, whatever it was. You've arrived. And you're there to worship the Lord, the God who brought his people out of Egypt, the God who called the house of David, who allowed his son Solomon to build this temple. And there you are, approaching this building. How do you approach it? Well, it's probably not sort of thinking about the football results, A, because they didn't know how to play football then, but, you know, those sorts of casual things aren't there. You're stopping and you're thinking to yourself, wow, I'm at the temple. I am at the place where God has promised to have his name dwell, where God's glory had appeared when Solomon had had his prayer of dedication, just as it had appeared earlier at the tabernacle when it was inducted. Here you are. You can't then bring yourself simply to stroll in. It's like, hey, it's the temple, it's my turn. No. You are here to encounter the living God. It's not just that it was an impressive building. There's a question that nags at the mind. What sort of person gets to stay there? Who is it who gets to dwell in the presence of God? That's an ancient question, and yet, I hope, as you arrived this morning, it's a modern one. What is it to come into the presence of God? What sort of person are we to be if we are going to live in his presence? How do we conduct ourselves? What do we look like? Does it matter is it about how we dress? Is it about how we play our music? Or is there something else that's going on? The question, please note, is not how do I get saved? We're going to assume for the purposes of this discussion today that I'm talking to believers. If you are not yet a believer, we can have a very good chat with you after the service to tell you about the hope that we can have in Jesus. But I'm going to assume we're talking for believers now about, well, what next? How am I going to live in the presence of God? And it's with precisely these questions that the psalm opens with a question. First verse is a question. O Lord, who may dwell in your tent? Who may reside on your holy mountain? Now, who here isn't imagining, oh, there's one person who gets to stay there. You know, Pablo, he's a good guy, right? He's a Bible scholar who's emerging. He's got a PhD. He's done mission work in Chile. Pablo gets there, and if Pablo gets there, I suppose we better let Mikey and Ray. They can probably get there as well. No, it's not who. It's what sort of person. Because in Israel, the answer of who was, well, anyone who's committed to the Lord. It's the same as today. It's not some ethnic thing. But what God is interested in is the type of people, the character of those who dwell with him. And of course, it's expressed here in ancient terminology. So even though the psalm imagines someone going up to the temple, it speaks in the language of a tent. Because we remember, of course, that before there was a temple, David had the ark kept on Mount Zion. And it wasn't even a proper tent. If you look at the Hebrew of 2 Samuel 7, it's just hidden behind curtains. You wouldn't even say it was camping properly at that stage. But of course, the tent also remembers the days when there was a tabernacle and you would go there. Now, I know that some of you will remember a tradition of tent meetings in the past. I don't think that's the sort of tent that they necessarily had in mind either. It's not, though, our pattern. We don't, even with tent meetings, we don't sort of imagine that we're just going to dwell with God in that tent and that tent alone. It's expressed in language that makes sense for ancient Israel. But the question matters. If we are going to live in the presence of God, through the hope that Jesus Christ gives us in the power of the Holy Spirit, what sort of person ought we to be? What is it going to look like to dwell in the presence of God? That's the question. And there is an answer that's given from verse 2 to the first half of verse 5. And you might recognise that the psalm is actually structured around question and answer. So we can perhaps imagine the worshipper approaching the temple and they're asking the question. And as they reach the temple, one of the gatekeepers, one of the Levites, is there to give the answer. Those conducting themselves blamelessly, practicing what is right, speaking the truth within. There is no slander on their tongue. They do not harm their neighbour, nor take up a taunt against their associates. Despised in their eyes are the reprobate, but they honour those who fear the Lord. They swear an oath to their disadvantage and do not change. They do not lend their money with interest, nor take a bribe against the innocent. Here is someone who wants to do what almost seems impossible, to dwell in the temple. Because in fact, we know that nobody got to dwell in the temple. That wasn't where you stayed. If you remember the story of Samuel, he stayed just on the edge and still heard things that went bump in the night when the Lord turned up. That's a technical way of expressing it, obviously. But here is the question. And the way the answer is phrased, verse 2 is the summary for us. Verse 2 sort of says, here's the general practice. And the way it's written in Hebrew indicates that verse 2 is describing characteristic actions. And then from verse 3 to the first half of verse 5, the form of the verbs changes to indicate that we're giving specific examples of the types of things that are going to be done. So the way we have to read this psalm is slightly strange in that we go to verse 2 and then we keep going, how do the various elements of verse 2 work out in what follows? And there's a complex pattern of how that's done. But if you think about it, we've got general guidance, and then because the psalmist knows what most of us know, which is we don't have specific examples, general guidance just feels too vague and we don't know what to do with it. But it's important to say that the examples from verse 3 on are not the completed list. It's not a case of, that's the whole list, I've done it. Right? This is actually about saying, right, I'm going to set for you the course, the general direction that you are going to follow in verse 2. And then I'm going to say, thinking about that, here's how it's going to work out. So when we flew over here, the captain of the aircraft set the course. And we could see the map that we were going to follow on the in-flight service, except for when we came up here on Air Canada, because that needed us to have an app on our phone and not having roaming turned on the aircraft, being on flight mode and so on. I'm like, that's not going to happen. But at least we know that the captain must have done that because we landed, right? We had a lovely view of the lake and came in and saw the city centre, and it was a kind of special fly past for us just to come and see what Toronto has. But there was a route. But then once you had the route, they had to make lots of individual decisions about how is that going to work out. Verse 2, we're setting the route for us. The rest of the psalm is saying, here's how it's going to work out. So, notice how verse 2 begins. Those conducting themselves blamelessly. Those practicing what is right. Speaking the truth within. I'm going to work backwards through those because the way of the patterning of how we then get to the examples. So verse 2 reminds us of the importance of speaking the truth within, or perhaps more literally, speaking the truth in the heart. And it's important to say that in the Old Testament, truth is not simply fact. So, sitting there and going in my heart, 2 + 2 = 4, I've spoken truth in my heart, isn't really the point. Because the word for truth is also the word for faithfulness in Hebrew. It's about true relationship with others that we are focused upon. Am I engaging well with somebody such that I am true to them as well as true factually? Those elements come together in faithfulness. But notice where it starts. It starts within. It starts in the heart. You see, many of us know that as Christians, I shouldn't say those things. And so we're good at bridling the tongue. It's like the thought is there. The brain is engaging the tongue gear and winding up and getting ready to say that thing. And then we suddenly say to ourselves, no, I'm a Christian. I'm not allowed to say that. I've got to stop. Right? It's better that we stop there than, later on, just to be clear. But the psalm is saying we've already started on the wrong direction. We're trying to get into a situation then of going, this is what I really, really think, but because I'm a Christian, I'm not going to say it. No, if we're speaking truth within, we're actually thinking to ourselves, right, how do I honour who you are? How do I build relationship with you in a way that's going to be constructive, that's going to be wholesome, that's going to be Christ-honouring? That's where I'm going to start with what I'm saying. But also, please note, the language of what you say in the heart in Psalm 15 is an immediate contrast to what the fool says in their heart in Psalm 14, where the fool says, there is no God, and as a result thinks, I can treat others in whatever way is to my benefit. And Psalm 15 is sitting here as a deliberate contrast then to Psalm 14. They say in their heart, but we say in our heart, how do I actually think of the other who is a part of the community and think about what is good for them? And verse 3 gives us examples for this. The person who speaks with faithfulness to others from within doesn't slander. That is, all right, we've now reached the point of practical speech. But the practical speech is not just the, whoops, I stop myself every time I'm going to say the wrong thing. But actually there is a case of saying, well, I'm never going to get to the point of slander. Now, I'm hoping that this is not a church that is filled with slander, but I've been in plenty of churches where I just need to share a prayer point that I'm feeling about this brother or this sister, right? And quite what the prayer point that is being shared, and it's relative to certain fact and whether it's appropriate to be shared or other such things, I'm not entirely sure. And so we can easily find ways that we convince ourselves that we're doing the right thing. But actually there is practical speech that comes out that's clear. And notice also what happens when we get to verse 4. This person can be trusted to do what they say. They swear an oath even when it's to their disadvantage, and they carry it through. They've said something, and they do it. Of course, Jesus himself says, let your yes be yes, and your no be no. There is a transparent honesty that is available, but also recognizing that if we're going to make a commitment to somebody else, that commitment is something we take seriously. Promises are not given lightly. If I am going to promise to do something for somebody, who is a brother or sister, then I have to say, am I actually going to do that? I don't just say, oh yeah, I'll do it. I don't know if you've ever had the experience, it's happened to me often enough, of somebody who's promised that they're going to be a part of some event or some ministry, and then they're not there because something else happens. Right? Now, fully accept that there are times when circumstances change so dramatically in ways that you couldn't have expected that, that's just what's going to happen. But so I'm thinking more in terms of those ones of, yeah, I'll be there, I'll help you. And then they're not there. Or they're finding a way to go, oh, I was going to give the whole time, I can only give you 5 minutes, and as if somehow that's done what's needed. No. The psalmist is saying, if you're going to dwell in God's presence, when you've made a commitment, you're going to carry it through. In sum, these people are making God's priorities their priorities, because this is how God acts. And if you've made God's priorities your priorities, it's going to emerge in your speech, starting with what you think. Another thing in verse 2, though, let's go back again. This person does what is right. Now, that may seem a little bit vague, so it's good to know that the psalm wants to give us some examples to flesh that out. But doing what is right is we are looking for what is just, what is good, what is promoting the well-being of someone else. But look at the latter part of verse 3 where we start to get examples. They do not harm their neighbour, nor take up a taunt against their associates. Now, the second part is not entirely clear. But what's suggested by the first, I think, interprets it. In their relationships with the community of which they're a part, these people are saying, what is positive? What is helpful? I'm not here to say, how do I take advantage of my neighbour in ways that are going to build me up? They are actually saying exact opposite. I can't take a taunt up against them. It can't be about making myself feel better by making them worse. Rather, I am trying to find ways of building somebody up. And then the next example clarifies that for us, because they lend to the poor without interest. Now, we have to understand something about the loan structures of the ancient world. In our world, certainly in Britain, and I'm assuming probably in Canada, but we've not yet had 48 hours in Canada or on the ground, so I'm going to admit that my knowledge is limited, right? But in our experience, people, if they're borrowing, are usually doing so for capital projects. They're buying a house, or they need to buy a car, or there is some business thing that they're trying to get started. So loans are primarily for those sorts of things. But in Britain, there is a thing called a payday loan, where we have a lot of loan companies who, I think the word shark is meant to be included, or the people standing at the counter especially hide the fin on their back so that you can't see it whilst they're putting the loan processes into practice for you, because you pay extortionate rates. And these are loans for people who the next paycheck won't come in before the bills, and so you're borrowing against the next paycheck. Most loans in the ancient Near East were that pattern. You had a bad harvest, therefore you can't feed your family. So you need some seed to put aside so you can sow next year's crop. And so you are borrowing, not because you have a capital project, but because otherwise you won't feed your family. But typical interest rates, we know from ancient Near Eastern sources, were in the range of 30 to 50% per annum. Now, at 30% per annum, it will take 2 years and 4 months before you owe double what you borrowed in the first place. At 50%, it will take 19 months before what you owe has doubled. And if you can imagine that you are dependent upon the crop coming in, and most people are more in the line of subsistence farmers, you realise how dangerous the interest was. And one of the common words for interest in the Old Testament is the same as the word for snake bite. I'm not sure if that's an accident or not, but in Australia we have snakes. I don't know if, in Britain they say they have a snake called the adder, but we look at it and we go, sorry, you call that a snake? It's not a snake. This is a snake, right? But, it's dangerous, right? Here is somebody, though, who's prepared to say, actually, I'm probably somebody at risk from my crop in the same way as you are. But you're a part of the community of God's people. Therefore, I will lend to you, placing myself at risk so that you may flourish alongside me. That's what doing what is right starts to look like. So these people not only speak truly, they do what is right. But note also that they live with integrity. Now, in the usage of the Old Testament, this is a way of saying, I live in a way that is committed to the Lord. Interestingly enough, the term for integrity is also the word that's used in the sacrificial system to describe an animal that is without blemish. This is Pablo's area of specialty. He knows more about this than anyone else. I'm sort of playing in the lower leagues, but he's in the professionals on this particular area. And this is really what verse 4 is then going to start to explore. You despise the reprobate, but you honour those who fear the Lord. Your integrity says, am I dealing with somebody who puts God first or not? Because the reprobate are the people, like the fool, who is alluded to again in the psalm at this point, who is saying there is no God. And you're saying, well, that's not the person where I can put the effort in, because they're rejecting the very thing that we're talking about. We're casting our pearls before swine at that particular point. No, we honour those who fear the Lord. So the question is this somebody who wants to honour God? Paul, of course, writing to the Galatians, urges them to do good to all people, but especially the household of faith. That is to say, is there someone who is honouring the Lord? Then I am going to be focused on them. I'm going to be focused on ensuring that they are living in a way that flourishes, that grows. So, what does it look like? Well, we speak truth, we do what is right, we walk with integrity. But notice there's something really interesting about these illustrations, because the person has approached the temple. What do they want to do? They want to dwell with God in the temple. What is the answer? You don't stay in the temple, my friend. If you want to dwell with God in worship, the way that you will do it is by going back to the community of the people of God and making God's priorities your priorities as you relate with them. We do not retreat from the world of which we are a part and say, hallelujah, I'm away from all of this, now I can be with God. We say instead, the God who loved us and gave himself for us says, you will go and find me. You will meet with me. Yes, when you come here, but even more so as you live amongst God's people, doing the things that God desires. For us, of course, that community is the church. We came here desiring to meet with God. We have shared the bread and the wine. But the way that we will live out the bread and the wine is actually in the communities of which God has placed us. A community where we continue to speak and to look and to live with integrity and hope that is focused on building up the other. You see, that's the paradox. The more you want to retreat to be in the presence of God, the more God calls us to go and be a part of the community of the people who are around us and meet with God as we share in service of him there. And to that person, the psalm ends with a promise. It's a wonderful promise. Whoever does these things will never be shaken. That doesn't mean that this person is going to be kept from the realities and the difficulties of life. If you've read the book of Psalms this far, you know that there are any number of Psalms already where the person's going, hang on, what am I doing with all these enemies? Why am I sick? Why am I being falsely accused of crimes? Things that go pretty badly wrong along the way. But what will happen here is that this person will never be away from the presence of God. And it's picking up the imagery of a journey, the one whose walk, literally in verse 2, is right. Here is the journey. We are journeying through life. And as you journey through life on paths, you will know that there are many places that can be a bit awkward, where your feet can go from under you. The psalm is saying, when you're on this journey with God, that's the part that won't be shaken. You won't be stumbling at any point along the way. You are walking with the Lord. So the question of the psalm, I want to suggest, is one that we all need to ask of ourselves as we arrive and also as we prepare to leave. Because we need to put ourselves before the answer and to ask ourselves, have we made God's priorities our priorities in what we're doing? And then to test that by asking whether we express that in our relationship with others. If we are looking to say, how and where will I meet with God in the service of the people of God? In seeking to say, how do I contribute to the flourishing of all God's people? Probably none of us attain to the standards of this psalm perfectly, but the psalm is asking us to say, here is the course on which you set yourself for your journey. To orient ourselves towards being God's people in practice, to bring our worship and our commitment to justice together, because then the promise is ours. And more than that, one of the questions that people keep on asking who don't know God is, where is God in the world? That was the question of Psalm 14. And Psalm 15, this is not the whole answer, incidentally, of where is God in the world, but one part of how people realise that there is a God in the world is when the people of God are making God's priorities their priorities, when they are living out the difference that the gospel has made in their lives. And then even people who might be previously going, I'm not sure about God, are left saying, no, to say there is no God is the fool. We need a different way of living. It's no surprise, and here I will end just in case you're wondering that this is going to go on far too long, that when we read, for example, Paul's letter to the Ephesians in chapters 3 and 4, how does he work out what's going on? He's talked about the fact that we've become the one new body, one gathering together in Christ. He then expresses that and says, how do we do it? By being the body, by working for the well-being of the other. We come into the presence of God and we desire to stay in the presence of God, and God says, I want you in my presence, but you will find my presence by being among my people and living out my priorities amongst them. May God bless you as you journey in that way. Amen.